Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Kelly. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
and a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human,
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture,
and what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Aaron. How you doing?
How's it going? Good.
Good. Yeah. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you. You've been traveling, yeah.
I have, yeah. I was in New York for a couple weeks, and that was amazing. I got to see some old friends, see family. So, yeah. And it's always good to come home when you travel, too.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And 2 weeks that's a long time. I would be ready to be home.
Yeah.
Well, I'm super excited today because we have an awesome guest with us, Ignacio Sanchez Prado, who is a professor of humanities at Washington University in St. Louis and is my former professor. And he's also a prolific writer, has written multiple books, articles. He's a scholar of film, food, culture. And I mean, he's one of the most knowledgeable people I have ever met. The number of things that he can just kind of like, profess about it seems kind of limitless. So I'm really, really excited to have him on the show today. And I think we're going to cover a lot of different ground since you are an expert on so many different things.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here.
So, Ignacio, I don't know if you want to maybe just like share with the audience a little bit about your background, your areas of expertise, the things that maybe interest you most and that you love to talk about.
Yeah, so I was born in Mexico City. I lived in there till age 18 and moved to a city next door called Puebla for 4 years for college. And then I came to the United States in 2001 to get my degree at the University of Pittsburgh. And after that degree, my doctoral degree, I became a professor at Washington University in 2006. My original academic training is in literature. The program was just called literature, and here it would be comparative literature, so literature from all around the world. My doctoral degree is just on Latin America. And then on the side, I'm a very big cinephile which began in Mexico because the Cinematheque of Mexico was very close to my high school. The study of literature, as I experienced it, became cultural studies, especially during my time in Pittsburgh. So that means that we apply critical perspectives, not only to literature or cinema, but also to all kinds of cultural things, from food to pop music to art, right? And that's more or less what I do. And I have mostly been focused on Mexico. But I think you mentioned the knowledgeability, but the reason why I became like is because I come from a tradition where erudition is valued. So you are not expected to just be a specialist in whatever it is your job, but a person dedicated to this has to know about everything and has to strive to continue learning about these things. This is particularly the case of one of my mentors from Mexico. His name is Pedro Angel Palou, who's now a professor in Tufts. And he's a well-known Mexican novelist, and he's also this kind of voracious, learn about everything type. And that's where I got it from. So that's why I end up having opinions about everything, but I also try to read and watch as much as I can about everything. And that's how I end up moving from topic to topic to topic in teaching and in writing and so on.
Yeah. So, for the audience, we can see your background right now, which is just one of your many bookshelves. Remind me how many books you have in your house?
About 15,000.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, you're certainly the right guest for our podcast because Aaron and I both are, while we are not as knowledgeable about so many things as you, we strive to probably learn about as many things. So we're both enthusiasts.
It's an unmodest thing to say. Some people don't like it, but I think that the reason why I emphasize it is because we need to go back to valuing knowledge. Mm-hmm. And we live in a time when the knowledge is not valued enough. Mm-hmm. And that has many nefarious social and political consequences. And those of us who are devoted to it, we need to fight for it, right? And hiding it because it's not polite in conversation is not, it contributes to that anti-intellectualism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Couldn't agree with that more. So I'm curious. So, we talked a little bit about the concept of the show here, and we've shared our atheistic similarities.
Yeah.
Views.
Oh, and yeah.
Oh, what were you going to say, Kelly? Sorry.
Well, we've shared that the concept that I'm a theist and that you're an atheist. And Ignacio, you said you are a devout materialist.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk to us?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as most Mexicans, I was born in a Catholic household. My mother was interested in her religious faith because she was very strong in terms of faith. And like many Catholics, her faith was not necessarily clinched to Jesus, but to a saint. And in her case, it was St. Jude. There's a family tradition of being devoutly following to St. Jude, which is also different in Mexico because most people in Mexico follow the Virgin of Guadalupe, actually. She definitely not like church. She thought that priests were corrupt, that the church was not following its mandate. So she didn't go to mass, for example, or anything like that. She used to go to the pilgrimage of St. Jude every month, to the Church of St. Jude in Mexico City, but not to... She was very skeptical about the institution of the Catholic Church. So there was already a seed for me, right? Like, you believe in the faith, but not in the institution. Also, the Catholic Church in Mexico is very powerful, very tied to certain forms of politics that she did not agree with. But then what happened with me is we had a very difficult time when I was a teenager because she lost her job. And then as a woman in her 40s, nobody would hire her, a single mother in her 40s. So we became almost homeless, not quite because friends kept us out of the street. Any shred of faith I had was lost there because I see this woman that struggled all her life that was very faithful. And then we are in this situation. And ultimately, what the lesson that I drew from that was that you're in the world and you have to work with the world in front of you. And sometimes faith can be an obstacle to see the world that you have right next to you. I don't belong to militant atheism, to the kind that wishes that religion went away. It's really a non-issue for me in my everyday life. Mm-hmm. I told Erin that it was interesting to be invited to this because religion is not something that is in my mind. Mm-hmm. To me, the issue that I have is not whether people believe or not, but I think that, and I hope I don't come off as I'm going to say something that some people are going to find an objection to, but I think that oftentimes what I see is that religion covers hateful ideologies, and it's something that people just to justify some things that are politically objectionable, while at the same time they don't follow some of the more difficult things to follow about faith, about being charitable, about being, self-sacrificing. Yeah. So that's more or less what I think that I face a lot of hypocrisy from people who call themselves religious, and that also tore me away from religion.
Yeah. I can understand that for sure.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think, we share that. And I think, that was my experience as, growing up, and I was also raised Catholic, and then figured out I was gay. And then, it was not, there was, I no longer had a place, right, in that community. And I do see the benefit into some people, that sense of community that can be created as a result of being a part of a religious community. But I also think that you can derive a lot of those same benefits from creating different communities that aren't necessarily based on religious ideas. So,
yeah. And I also find the Catholicism in the US to be more orthodox and more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we know that the cardinals from the US are at odds with Pope Francis, right? Who comes from a more left, like, I don't know if I would call it leftist, but more progressive Latin American Catholicism tied to theology of liberation and things like that. In Mexico, so many people are Catholic that the degree of participation in the faith varies considerably, and Mexico has become a fairly progressive country in the past few years. So the more conservative Catholicism is mostly the Catholicism of the wealthy elites. The everyday people have some mores about conservatism, machismo and things like that, but at the same time, gay marriage is legal, abortion became legal, is more legal now in Mexico than it is here, right? The separation of church and state is constitutional and very strict. So a president that invokes God in a speech may, in fact, be breaking the Constitution. So I think that also because we have 175 years of legalized secularism, even religious people strongly support the separation of church and state in a way that is not the case here, where people wear their faith on their sleeves. If our president is an evangelical Christian leftist, and you wouldn't know because he doesn't talk about his evangelical Christian faith from his pulpit, right? So
that's really interesting.
Yeah. He has done nothing to stop abortion rights or anything like that, even though he does not believe in that. So.
Right. Yeah. And I think here in the United States, there are a subset of religious people who are like that. But I think the press is given more to those, like you said, those more kind of Christian nationalist people where their religion and their politics are just intertwined, and and it's difficult. Now, when you talk about kind of, you had said before when we were kind of getting ready that you're not a spiritual person. Do you differentiate between religious and spiritual at all, or are those the same?
Yes, they're different.
Yeah.
To me, spirituality is having a relationship with something transcendental, even if it's not like nominally a deity, right? I don't feel that. I don't have that feeling in me.
Yeah. So like, you would say
I don't feel connections with nature either.
Really?
Okay.
I actually don't like to be in nature. I like to be in cities. I like the chaotic. I like the bigger the city, the better for me. I'm not at all a contemplative person. I'm always wired and always thinking about 7 or 10 things. So I don't even have focused attention. Like if I go to a museum, I'm not the kind of person that stands in front of a work of art and feels something. I tend to be hyper analytical in my relationship to those things, from which I draw a lot of enjoyment, and I can appreciate beauty, but it's not transcendental to me.
Yeah.
Like if you see me watching a movie at home, I'm analyzing the movie as I watch it. I'm looking for information about it on my phone because it is I like process rather than outcome. So it's all thoroughly materialist.
That's so interesting to me. So what is it that, like, for you, like, is there anything that kind of sparks a sense of like awe, I guess?
I mean, I feel awe, but the awe is processual, right? So if it's a film, which is one of the things that I connect with the most, is because the way it's made, the technique, right? I've been perceptive to those things. But I don't think there's anything that is above or beyond that, right? Obviously, if you think of someone that is an artistic genius, it elicits, in academia we say affects, right? It's like emotions plus.
Right.
And some people might interpret that as a transcendental or a spiritual thing, but to me, it is so tied to the process of the object that, and I always so analytical about things that it really breaks any kind of sense of spirituality detached from that grounded thing. I mean, I don't discount that the same things generate a feeling of spirituality to other people. It's just that I don't see anything that transcends the concreteness of that work.
Gotcha. Yeah, I understand that. So you can have an emotional experience, like a movie can make you cry.
Well, no, not cry, but other emotional experience. I can be moved.
You can be moved.
Yeah.
You can be
I can be moved by some things, like, there's some movies also that that represent reality similar to the ones of my youth, right? Others,
sure.
But the thing is that it isn't. I always have the distancing effect of, I know how this is made.
Yeah.
And in all the things that I enjoy, I'm also a scholar of that as a critic. So I don't confront anything without a significant knowledge about how those things work. And understanding the workings preempts to me to have that kind of unmediated spiritual or emotional reaction.
Interesting.
I'm not an emotional, but my emotions are always sort of caught by I have a very functional rationality. And even when I'm in my worst, I can step out of myself and be like, okay, this is what's happening, and
so you're kind of Brechtian in the way you look at art.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
You need that distance is important. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I get, I'm curious about this. So I often think about like an experience of, and maybe spirituality is the wrong word to use in this, but is, I kind of look at, as I move throughout my like day-to-day experience, that, I'm spending a lot of time in what I describe as like ego mode, right? Like what do I need to be doing right now? And it's like kind of, you're focused on yourself essentially. And then the things that I find that like push me out of that mode. So maybe it's, having a meal with another person or going and seeing a play, or like these things that I think we could say are awe sometimes on a small or large scale. They like push me out of that kind of like frame of thinking. What is your experience, or like with something like that? What are the things that like push you out of?
Well, I describe my brain as a multi-lane highway, and it has cars running in the lanes. To me, to have focus means that I'm driving all the cars, right? But there's always many cars. When I'm on focus, it means that the cars are just changing lanes, so my brain is just like a mess, right? To be functional, I sort of put myself in the driver's seat of those cars. So the main car, the one in the center lane, is the one that focuses me in the situation that I have, kind of like talking to you. But I have cars in other directions, like I'm thinking about what I'm going to do later, or I'm thinking about a movie that I watched last night, or a book that I'm reading. And all of that in my head happens at the same time. And I think that because I don't have focus, that also the experience of spirituality, I guess, is meant to flood your senses, your perception in some way. But that flooding is not something that happens to me hardly at all. So I'm always on something else. And, it's an extreme case of like materialist groundedness, I would say, but I draw a lot of enjoyment from it. Like I don't think of it as a problem. I think of it as an advantage. It has let me build a career as an academic, for example. And everything that I do, I enjoy very much. And even when I'm busy, I have developed the habit, especially because COVID was very wrecking to my time. I developed the habit of just forcing myself to watch the movie and read the book rather than letting me be absorbed by the minutiae of everyday life. But it's not that I have a pretty bohemian life in some ways, but it doesn't have this kind of transcendental narrative.
It's interesting.
when you describe kind of how your brain works with all those lanes and those is part of that kind of having all these things going at the same time, is it about looking for connections between these things too? Like, are you looking for...
Sometimes and sometimes not,
Okay.
Sometimes they happen.
Yeah.
If you read my academic work, the stuff that I'm the most known for is the one that grabs an enormous amount of things and puts them together. So I wrote the sort of the history of reference of contemporary Mexican cinema. And that's because I was a crazy person that sat down to watch 250 movies and made connections between them. There's some people that are very good at looking at one thing and then drawing out of that all the minutiae and details and everything. And I cannot do that. Like, I couldn't be a professor of English because they're very committed to close reading, and I'm not a close reader at all. Like, I can perform it, but my close reading is basically sit down and use all my frame of reference and put it into what I'm reading, rather than looking for a thing in itself. It's different modes of thinking, right? But to me, the knowledge that I accumulate all the time is my departing point for experiencing or for thinking or for working anything, and that's in some of those cars all the time. Sometimes it's just I have the news. I have a TV. This is my desk. I have a TV right here, and I put something on the TV when I'm writing. Like, I cannot work in silence. Because I need to have something grabbing. When I had lines of distraction, they have to be grabbed onto something. Like, people think I'm rude because I'm on my phone all the time, but I actually can pay attention and look at Facebook at the same time.
I love it. I love that what's really interesting is just that you know yourself so well, and you know the way your brain works so well, and you don't try to kind of adjust it to maybe, like, oh, well, I'm told an academic does this, or I'm told this is, and just you found this.
Well, that has been my process growth to do myself, no? That doesn't mean that I don't have difficult moments. I can burst.
Yeah.
But I really have developed self-knowledge because I'm thinking all the time. So that means that I also think a lot about myself, my situation, and over time that strengthens me. Is not. I don't want to come out as a person that is fully in control of myself, because I'm not. It's not without flaws or without these problems, right? There are things, everybody has unresolved issues,
right?
But it really has allowed me to push through.
Yeah.
In a way that, and some things that people use to cope with reality, they don't work on me because I don't necessarily carry that need with me.
Yeah.
I think that religion is one of those categories, right? I don't need to latch to a faith for something. Now, if I find an unsolvable situation in my future, I don't know how I would react to that, right? But I haven't really come across something that is so fully out of my control that I just have to jump into the void, right?
Yeah,
it will happen because we all die, right? We'll get the terminal illness, but at the same time, I think, like, well, it's going to happen anyways, right? So when it comes, it comes. So that's the kind of thinking. It really filters a lot of things, and really I'm more hit by shocks rather than by a long-standing concern for something.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that raises a good point, which is that I think a lot of the reason that people end up finding religion or turning towards religion, if it's not something that they are raised with, is because they find themselves in a period of life where they're like, I don't know how to deal with whatever, issue is in front of me. So what are the things that you turn to when you're like, this is a difficulty and I need this as an outlet?
I mean, one is my analytics, right? So what can I do? What can I do? I'm very fueled by frustration. So when I'm frustrated, that tends to spin me into trying to find a solution to the frustration, sometimes wisely and sometimes very unwisely, because I also want to solve things fast. And sometimes it's just, in terms of self-care, it's just that I just sit and watch a movie, read a book, I go eat something, right? Like culture is my refuge in the broader sense. And, disconnecting yourself from a situation is always very helpful. I try not to be, I think that thinking about the thing that plagues you while it's plaguing you is actually pretty counterproductive. So I do think that diversion is a good technique. And if you are someone that can sit down, read books, watch movies, or unfloat yourself with that, it really helps with diversion, with emotional diversion quite a bit.
Yeah. So should we talk? Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Kelly.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's a gift too, because I know in periods of my life when I have been in real difficulty, I can tell when I'm like emotionally distraught because I can't sit down and read a book.
Yeah.
I can't like watch a movie. And so the fact that I love what you said, culture.
I have to pick up the thing that I can read at any given time. So I cannot watch anything on demand all the time. It really has to be where my brain is, where my emotions are on a given day. Like last night, I was really tired, and someone I know passed away yesterday. So I sat down and watched a documentary because that was cold and unemotional, and it took me away from being thrown off from this person who was, he wasn't a close friend, but he was a good friend. And it was completely unexpected. So, but you mean I wasn't devastated? I was sad, and then I can turn into something that helps me sort of iron out myself.
That makes sense.
Some people read this as an emotionality, but it's really just managed emotionality. And you said it's a gift, and I'm always very careful. And something that I learned, I give a lot of advice, which is a really bad habit, but I think that's probably the most difficult thing to be my friend is that I have too much advice to give, and sometimes people don't want advice; they want empathy, which I have and I don't have. It's kind of weird, my relationship to empathy, but I had to learn that I'm me, and it's very hard to be who I am. And I have some cognitive, emotional traits that most people don't. Like nobody can read at my pace, nobody can watch movies at my pace. It's very few people who have that ability. It requires a combination of cognitive, but also of privilege, right? Like I have a job that lets me do it. I have a family situation that lets me do it. Someone with kids cannot have my pace by any means. Someone dealing with the care of a parent in a long-term care situation cannot do what I do, right? Someone that has to work in an office 40 hours a week cannot do what I do. So one has to, I think that I always tell my students that you have to be very careful that no one is comparable to no one else. That's only a source of anxiety. And I think that one reason why I don't feel as much anxiety is because I have for many years stopped comparing myself to others for good and for bad. Like I don't actually think I'm better than others either. I just think that I'm different.
Yeah, that's a key, right? And it's certainly something that I think is contributing to a lot of people struggling with anxiety because they spend copious amounts of time in comparison.
Yeah, and if you let comparisons validate you, then you allow them. You become vulnerable to the negative.
Yeah,
it really requires that you don't take the positive seriously either.
Yep. That's the trick, right? So I did want to talk a little bit about so I know you're working on a book, or maybe you finished the book on
almost
the history.
Finished. It's due on October 1st.
October 1st.
I'm in the last rounds. I'm in the last round of writing.
So tell us about the book, and maybe also just like about your process as a writer.
Yeah. So the book is it's just called Taco. It's gonna be published. There is a series in Bloomsbury Press that is called Object Lessons, and they are very short black books, little paperbacks. They're $10 or $12 or something like that. and they are about an object. But rather than being an exhaustive book about the object, the author has the freedom to grab them from their personal perspective, right? So someone who wrote about wine, the book is about her experience living in vineyards in Spain. There is a really great writer called Joanna Walsh who wrote about hotel, and she wrote about city hotels. There's another academic who wrote potato, and she wrote a more like wonky historical book. So the taco book, I wrote it as a chronicle of being from Mexico City, experiencing that culture, and then coming to the US and confronting the culture of the US. And that has wrapped an essay challenging the idea of authenticity in Mexican food, which is not really, I thought for many years that it was a thing, but it's really not a thing. There is no such thing as authentic Mexican food. There is variations of Mexican food because food is from the get-go a cultural mixture, particularly in a country like Mexico where our identity is grounded in the mixtures of culture. The Mexican culture is a mixture of cultures. So it's nonsense to speak about authenticity. So the book goes in that direction. Now, my process is that I'm distracted. So I write 6 or 7 books over years at the same time. And then years, I mean a decade, I just jump from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And when I get close to finish one, then I sit down and I finish the one. So I've been working on materials for food studies for like a good 7 or 8 years. This is the first book that is going to come out of it. I haven't written very much about it yet, but I have material to write forward. I don't think I'm going to write books about it, but I'm probably going to write articles and public-facing stuff because it lends more to that in my case. But I'm writing a book on cinema that I have been writing for 12 years. So, and hopefully that will be done in the next 2 years.
So what draws you into like your interest in food and in cultures, and the intersection of those two things? Like what is it that makes you gravitate towards that?
I mean, if I were to describe my research in one word, is because I can capture so much information, is that I like to draw connections between processes, including institutions, and the meaning and social uses and the objects that get produced by those processes, right? So if you think about my work on cinema, I research film industries like a sociologist would or an economist, but I also research the aesthetic qualities of the films. And I sort of make the correlations, and also what kinds of audiences watch the films is a question that I have asked in my research, and how does that affect the films? And people usually do one or the other. So what I do is instead I get myself acquainted with the work of the people who do the individual things, and then I'm the one that sort of starts building the connections together. So I don't do economics of cinema, like I don't go and do an economic study myself, but I draw the economic studies that are there, and for that I draw conclusions that then I can use to analyze a specific film. And many people who write on film analysis don't work on economics. So that's my brain at work, right? Food lends itself to that because everything is wrapped on it. There's an economics of food, there's a sociology of food, there's a history of food. It can be analyzed from basically any field of the social, natural, and sciences, as well as the humanities. So it's the kind of thing that works for that kind of connective. Like I'm writing an essay on heirloom corn, and you need to know the biology of corn, but you also need to know peasant practices. You need to know biotechnology, right? And you need to know the history of industrialization, and you need to know, and then there's artworks about this, and then there's restaurants that create narratives on this. So that's the kind of thing that draws me to it.
Yeah.
So taco is an object that has all the history of corn wrapped into it, all the various regional variations, the various social uses.
So can I ask, in terms of like the economics, like you were just talking of cinema,
yeah,
what have you found? And I know you're more interested in processes than products, but how does the economics in different cultures of different countries making film, how have you found the economics of the film influence the product?
I mean, you can see a US example and a Mexican example that are very easy, right? the US is producing very little middle brow cinema, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see the better dramas or romantic comedies from the past few years. Most of them are from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the Oscars, right? Films like
Yep.
Parasite, like The Worst Person in the World, like Drive My Car, are films that have become very hard to make in the US. In the US, what we see, I mean, if we take the platforms apart, because if we just focus on the film theater, the films that are succeeding are $500 million budgets that have to go and overtake screens all over the world to make the business. And then they lose $150 or $200 million if they don't. You think of Furiosa, which failed, and even that's a good movie. But you know, the Deadpool versus Wolverine and everything. And in order for you to be able to have that kind of box office, you have to have a broad appeal, and so the movies are very flat culturally. And you also have to use intellectual property that is recognizable, because you cannot build an audience from scratch at that scale. Or the other things that succeed are $5 to $10 million budget horror films, because they only have to make 20 million, and this a genre that has a devout following. So if you go to the theater, into the movie theater in the summer, the two kinds of movies that you see are blockbusters of $500 million and a bunch of horror films that are released in succession. And in the middle, some niche things, like here in Missouri, a lot of Christian films, right? Because there's a built-in conservative audience. So they had the Costner cowboy movie, which is doing very well. And then last year they have this film called Sound of Freedom. Actually, the producers for that are the Mexican far right. They resonated a lot with Christian audiences in the US. So you see that they also know that there are sub-businesses, like the niche market of Christian audiences that don't want to go see Deadpool and Wolverine because it's very crass, but they will go see a well-budgeted Christian film. In Mexico, the big change was that it used to be subsidized, the price tickets, so the films were made for the working class. That stopped in the early 90s. And then the multiplexes opened, and they were and are very expensive. So a film ticket in Mexico City in 95 was equal to 3 days of minimum wage.
Oh, wow.
Even today, the minimum wage in Mexico is about $8 a day. And that's how a film ticket costs that, right? So it's a day of minimum wage. So film goers are middle class, upper class. So the few films that have box office success in Mexico that are Mexican are romantic comedies about middle class people, because that's what attracts the audiences. Although a lot of those people are very Americanized culturally, so 85% of the cinema shown in Mexico is Hollywood.
Yeah,
because the more upper class you're in Mexico, the more Americanized you are also. So that's an example of those dynamics.
Yeah.
What about the economic impact of the streaming platforms outside of like the traditional?
Well, you have to also think that the streaming platforms can only be paid by people who are wealthy enough to have broadband in their house, right? And even though the use of cell phones is extensive, a house internet is not as extensive, and also the cost of the house internet plus the platform can be prohibitive for half of Mexicans. Mexico is not a poor country, but it's an unequal country. There's a huge middle class that is very wealthy, but there is also a huge lower class that is very poor. There's more poverty. There's as much wealth as here, but there's more poverty. That's a good way to put it. So the stuff that goes into streaming in Mexico is sort of a continuation of what you see in the movie theaters. And the other thing that goes is prestige projects, because it's a lot of urban educated audiences, so a little bit more authorial cinema is right now in Mexico goes into the platforms. And that benefits us because we can see it here too, right? Because if Netflix buys it, it will show in most of the Netflixes in the world, especially if they put some money in the production. Netflix's model is about capturing the industries of individual countries and having local audiences and then see what they can outsource from each local audience to a global audience, but also having a subscriber base everywhere. So they don't care if an individual product is watched, and that's important. That's the difference with the film theater. They don't care that you make of the production budget one thing, but they care to keep a base of subscribers engaged all the time.
Right.
So their metrics is how many minutes of a film have been seen rather than did I recover the investment. So does this keep people watching, or do they drop it after minute 10? That's more valuable to them.
Yeah. So attention is the valuable thing.
Attention is valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. And they can identify where things are seen. So they can.
They have micro data. I mean, it's mostly confidential, but they have the ability to micro profile every one of their subscribers.
So what's your favorite film of the last, say, year or so?
That's very hard, but I mean, this year I think that the one that has stayed with me, I don't know if it's the best one I've seen, but the one that has stayed the most with me is a French film called The Beast, which played for like 3 days in St. Louis, and it now plays in a platform called the Criterion Channel. But it is about a love, it's sort of a reincarnation movie. It's a love story about sort of two people. And one takes, it's also an adaptation of Henry James, which is also so one part takes at the end of the 19th century, another one takes in the contemporary era, another one takes in the future, in a sort of a post-apocalyptic future. It's really great.
The Beast.
The Beast.
Is it kind of a takeoff on the fairy tale on like Beauty and the Beast?
No. It is
not at all.
Henry James. It is a Henry James short story. I don't remember the title now, but it is a Henry James title.
So so we've got your favorite movie of the last year. What's your favorite? What do you think the best restaurant in St. Louis is?
Ooh.
I mean, it was Bull Rush, which closed recently because of politics. Right?
Yeah, I did see that. Yeah.
The chef is gay, and he says that the anti-gay legislation that is coming out in St. Louis has made the state hostile for him, and that he doesn't want to support the state with revenue or taxes anymore, and that he doesn't think that it's going to be livable for people who are not like conservative Christians, basically. So he closed the restaurant and left the city.
Oh, that's so sad.
I think that, I mean, I'm going to make people angry with this, but I think that the scene was good before. I don't think the fine dining is great right now.
Yeah.
To me, that the problem with, I mean, of course, the cost in COVID was a big factor of that. The model of fine dining is also in crisis globally, but I think that the local palate is kind of conservative. So a lot of the restaurants had to end up selling pasta and more traditional, recognizable foods. The best of the food scene in St. Louis is the immigrant restaurants.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the best ones tend to be in strip malls in the county. Because there's a lot of middle class immigration working in the corporate areas over there. So the best Indian restaurants, one that I just discovered that is called Black Salt, is in the nondescript strip mall in Chesterfield, and it is astonishingly good.
Ooh, what is it?
It's called Black Salt.
Black Salt.
Okay.
Yeah. And what kind of food is it?
Indian.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, we'll have to take a.
It's not It's not like in the main. It's like in Clarkson Road in Chesterfield. And then, but like really far out. And then, Mexican restaurant. There's a really good one in South City, in like around Kings Highway, called Molino del Sureste. This is Yucatecan food. But my favorite taqueria is called El Toluco, and that's in 141 in Manchester. So I think that, to me, those are the places. Some people really like the Grand Corridor, but to me, those strip malls tend to attract very good immigrant restaurants because rent is cheaper.
Yeah.
And they don't have to cater to hipsters. And sometimes the catering means that the food is less spicy, or or they have to do some fusion. Whereas over there, really, their customer base is for the most part whatever nationality they are, and then and that means that they don't have to make as many concessions with the food.
So even being out like in the suburbs where there's maybe a more kind of conservative element, you find that they're still
I mean
because they're making food for
the conservative parties is interesting because we have cartoonish views of race, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely do not think that all white conservatives are anti-immigrant. I think it's a subset.
Mm-hmm.
What people tend to be most opposed to is undocumented migration.
Mm-hmm.
That's a horror potato, right? And to be clear, one of my most radical views is that I'm a border abolitionist, and I actually believe that Mexico, the US, and Canada should be integrated in terms of borders. It makes sense because the economies are integrated. And the reason why people don't do it is because people see Mexicans as racially inferior. And it's hard for people to wrap their head around being on an equal footing of citizenship as people from Mexico. But that is, I would say, even a minority subset of the American border, but it is one that has a lot of power, particularly in Republican primaries. But I don't even think that all Republicans are anti-immigration, because if you see the polling, it's actually not as clear-cut, and there's Democrats who are anti-immigration too, for sure. So with that in mind, there's a lot of migrants who are legal and professional, have professional degrees living in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And that kind of migrant, and also, or they're business owners, like even the owners of the restaurants.
Sure.
And those migrants are not seen as threatening by the vast majority of people who live there. And therefore, they patronize the restaurants. And the suburbs are not as close to immigration. I think most of the anti-immigrant vote tends to be rural, as far as I have seen it. And is racially motivated, but that has many dimensions. And it is not an easy Republican Democrat slice, even if our politicians make us think that it's that way. So that's why they settled there. They are patronized by the community. No one feels threatened by them. There's grocery stores from all kinds. I don't know if you probably have been into the Pan-Asian market that has every single Asian country under the sun. And it is a grocery store that people just patronize, like the Chinese supermarkets in Olive or the Mexican supermarket in Cherokee. You see Black customers, white customers, Latinx customers, Asian customers. It doesn't matter, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, and to me, because they pay less rent and because they have a community of middle-class migrants that they can build their customer base on, they tend to thrive in there in a way that is harder in the city, especially as the city is gentrifying.
I think that's really interesting. I think that's probably a bias that I have in my head, is that there aren't as many middle-class immigrants in the suburbs. Yeah,
but with the more restrictions, so you see a lot in the news about the migrants who are poor, right, and come undocumented. Many of them come in as refugees rather than as undocumented migrants, so that's why they can open businesses.
Right.
But there's a big professional immigration into the U.S. at all times also. So like migrants are multi-class, multi-race. You cannot make generalizations about what is a migrant, right?
Right.
They come from all over the place. So, I mean, Asia, Latin America, but also Europe, right? And obviously, and what if there's a trend right now, and especially in Latin American migration, is that it has gone from being a Southwest specific thing to really be all over the place. Like I have Mexican students who are from Idaho, Nebraska, for example.
Yeah. Man, it's so interesting. And, I mean, especially as we are kind of coming up on this next election, that is certainly a topic that I feel like is being used. And, I think that for most of us, we're living our lives in the Midwest. I mean, I don't have a lot of interaction with what's happening on the border, and you just hear, you're hearing all these different narratives that people want you to have. It
is not a non-issue, but it is not. I mean, it's not rosy either, right? Both parties play whatever they need to play to their advantage, but the situation essentially in the border is as a result of both economic migration and I think climate change migration, and more importantly, U.S. intervention in Latin America and other regions in the world. There are floods of migrants that are being pushed out of a variety of countries. The U.S. has over Mexico the power of NAFTA. So in the Trump administration, it was agreed that to give Mexico more favorable conditions in the renegotiation of NAFTA, Mexico had to keep migrants in the Mexican side of the border where they were processed. And the immigrants don't want to be there. And Mexico doesn't have the logistical infrastructure to have campaments of migrants all the time. So that makes them vulnerable to organized crime and things like that. So people keep trying to cross, right? Until they cross, and then they come, and then you have all these border state governors that rather than having a humane solution, they just put them in a bus and bus them to liberal cities to create a crisis in San Francisco or New York or something like that. Just playing political games, right? These people are in desperate situations, and the illegality of migration is not gonna stop them from coming. But you also have to think that there is lies about the migrants. It is grounded on economic anxiety. People think that their situation is sometimes even worse than it actually is. You have restaurants that cannot hire workers enough, and then you have all these people willing to work that are not allowed in, and then you have a social security system that is going to blow up because the population replacement is not sufficient, and then you have all these people who could come in with children, right, that could grow the base of taxation for social security, which would require them to be legal because that's the only way you can steadily and predictably contribute to those things. Migration creates economic growth, but it is because migrants don't vote, can't, right? You can throw a lot of you can deflect a lot of economic anxiety and anxiety about crime. Most crime in the US is committed by US citizens. But you create the image that the immigrant is a criminal, the immigrant is going to take your job. That allows politicians to be immune to the consequences of their own bad governing. And then even people who would not be anti-immigration, like, Vice President Harris, they have to show to be tough in the border because the anxiety level is so high that it has become an unpopular position to have a reasonable politics about the border. And nobody can win. Nobody's going to vote on the basis of being pro-immigration in the same way that until this election, we have never really seen people voting on the basis of being pro-choice. So the anti-position is a stronger electoral force than the pro-position, and that's why immigration is such a wreck.
Yeah. Man, you are a wealth of knowledge.
I try to pay attention, and immigration is something. I went through that immigration system myself as a student, I went through the privileged path, but it still took me 10 years to become a dual citizen, right? It's an absolutely baroque, unnecessarily baroque system. And the complications of the system make the national security process worse because it's harder for the US to know who's actually coming in. Whereas if you have a regulated system, they would have a good sense of everyone, and they will be able to make more rational decisions about who should be left out or brought in according to actual behaviors and actual, history.
I heard that Trump had said that he believes that if you are an immigrant who graduates from a U.S. university, you should automatically get citizenship.
Yes, we don't think that. I think that the thing is that there is a couple of contradictions in that coalition, right?
Yeah.
They have a lot of business community that relies on migrant labor, even educated migrant labor. And the reason why he says that is because he's courting Silicon Valley money. The single most affected sector of the restriction on visas is technology, because a lot of the people getting advanced degrees in engineering are foreign. Americans, because of how gutted the K-12 system is, don't develop enough science and math education to become an engineer in many districts. People should be very angry about that. Instead, they're angry at immigrants, right?
Right.
And if you train in China or in India or in Korea, the education is going to be much better in those subjects than in most American schools. So the tech companies need these migrants, and they're very angry about sort of these blanket anti-immigration policies. And that's why they correct course. And you also have to remember that in a lot of migrant communities, the ones who are citizens were Republican.
Mm-hmm.
The Vietnamese, for instance, have a very high, are far more Republican than Democratic.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, because Republicans embody either social conservatism, some of which they are too, but also this idea of individualism and the state leaving you alone. Some migrants who achieve economic success relate to that. And some communities like Venezuelans, Cubans, and the Vietnamese themselves, they came to the US fleeing socialist or communist dictatorships.
Mm-hmm.
So they do identify with the presentation of any state as inherently communist, and that's sold very effectively to them. Whereas for myself as a Mexican, where we come from a country where we value a big state, that doesn't work as much with most Mexicans. So Mexicans are mostly Democrats for that reason, like 67% Democratic to 23. And the Republicans tend to be people who have been here for generations, or who are very religious, or who really are into that entrepreneurial mindset.
Mm.
You have to, if you want to understand the politics of issues, you have to look at the immigrant communities in their diversity and complexity, rather than making blank assumptions as to people vote one way or the other because they are this identity.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Nuance.
Yep. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. It was going
to be about food that ended up being about everything.
I know. Well, that's I knew it would be. I knew it would be about everything. Because I feel like every time that when we would be in class, it was always like, I mean, we would always get back on track, but there would always be like many detours and side roads that were always equally fascinating to whatever like the topic was at hand.
I mean, but everything's connected, right?
Yep.
I do think that the job of scholars that like myself is to piece things together. There's a lot of misconceptions because people don't see. If people really knew the facts that are studied that immigration creates economic growth, they might not be so anti-immigrant, but that those connections are invisible to most people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Same thing, the stuff you eat is connected to so many things in so many ways, economic, environmental, that if you knew, you would think about things differently, right? And I'm not vegan, and I understand it doesn't mean that everybody's going to draw the same conclusions, right? I understand the climate change impact of meat, but I also have a response to those things. It's about how you think the broadest connections possible of everything that actually makes you a better thinker on the issues. Mm-hmm. So my chaotic, like tangential, multi-directional thinking ultimately aims to put things together in that way.
Oh. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for, taking the time to share all of the different pathways of thinking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I think one more question. Where should we go for lunch? And
I would say,
would you like to join us?
I could, but I would say El Molino del Sureste in Kings Highway. It's a Yucatecan restaurant that opened recently. They have two. They have that space, and they have a little store in the Alamo, in the Foundry by the Alamo Draft House.
Okay. Oh yeah, okay.
And the chefs are of Yucatecan heritage. They make many complex and beautiful dishes, but in particular, they make what I consider to be the best taco in St. Louis right now.
Ooh.
It's called a taco de Castacan, and it is a thick cut of pork belly that is deep fried and crunchy, served with a sauce of sliced tomatillos and some radishes. And one of the characteristics of the restaurants is one of the very few places in St. Louis where they make masa from scratch, from the corn. They do their own process of nixtamalization, which is the way in which corn is enriched with calcium to become masa, and they make tortillas out of that. And you can taste the difference in all of their masa products. But they have many great things. They make a mushroom mole that is wonderful. They make cochinita pibil, which is the traditional Yucatecan food, but they also make some departures. So they have a sweet white mole that is made with white chocolate and served with scallops. So they have both traditional and creative dishes.
Oh, wow.
It's my favorite restaurant in St. Louis right now. And I keep taking people there to make sure that they have customers and they don't close, because it's the kind of it's the kind of restaurant that makes a cuisine different enough that it might be challenging for them to establish themselves in the market. So,
well, we'll definitely post a link to them to the restaurant in the show notes, and I think we'll definitely have to go. I mean, you had me at deep fried pork belly.
Yeah. You may have a spiritual experience with that.
I think I might. I think I might see God in that. Yeah, 100%. Ignacio, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation. A huge heartfelt thank you to all of our listeners. Some of you joined us a year ago, some of you joined us recently, but all of you are helping us grow the show. Thank you so much.
Atheist is still advertising free, sponsor free, and available for free to everyone. Lots of podcasts have big production teams. Our team is just 3 friends working together to make something we hope puts good into the world and brings value to your life.
But we always need your help. Please spread the word and share the show. All of our social links and other ways to support the show are available on atheistpodcast.com.
Atheist is produced by Justin Sywell of Trend Media, STL. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.